With the World Cup, football is on almost everybody's mind these days. In today's program, Cours des Citoyens, let's have a look at what the court here in Luxembourg has had to say in this field, from the possibility of watching matches free of charge to the rights of professional players and the powers of football federations. All these football-related issues have ended up before the judges here at the Court of Justice of the European Union. Penalties, red cards, offsides, football has its own set of rules, but it is also subject to EU law. Professional sport can be considered an economic activity. Clubs and players are employers and employees with their duties and rights under EU law, just like any other economic operators. Football also often involves cross-border activities such as player transfers, competitions, and broadcasting rights. Let me introduce my colleague Stefan van der Jocht, with whom we'll explore how the Court of Justice of the EU has helped shape the legal landscape of sport in general and football in particular. Hello, Stefan, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here to talk about such a topical subject.
And let's start with television rights. Can member states ensure that major tournaments like World Cup remain available on free-to-air TV?
Yes, they can, and that's also thanks to a judgment of the General Court, which was then later confirmed on appeal by the Court of Justice. Here's the thing, holders of broadcasting rights or sporting rights, they can sell their rights to whoever they wish. It's a free market. There's one exception though, and that concerns events of major importance for society. And in that case, member states can request that such events are broadcast on free-to-air channels, so not hidden behind paywalls. And of course, the World Cup is one such event, just like the Euro Championships, for instance.
So in that context, public access outweighs purely commercial interests.
Yes, you could say that. It's important that the public is informed. There's a right to information. And so broad public access to such events should be guaranteed.
When we think about football and EU law, it's impossible not to mention the landmark Bosman ruling of 1995. Why was it so revolutionary?
Well, it's revolutionary because it changed the world of football as we knew it. The players were in a very unfavorable position with regard to their clubs, and the clubs were restricted because they could not field or select players from other EU countries, or at least only a limited number.
Could you tell our football fans what exactly was the case about?
Well, Bosman was a Belgian professional football player who was at the end of his contract with his Belgian club. And he wanted to join a French club. But that was effectively made very difficult for him because of the existing transfer system. It required actually an agreement between his former club and his new club. Although, as we said, he was at the end of his contract. And as to the clubs, there was also a rule, a nationality clause, which prohibited clubs to field players from or at least they could only field a limited number of players from other EU countries. So that put Bosman in a very difficult position to obtain that transfer.
And that changed everything? Because professional players, like any other EU workers, can now move freely at the end of their contracts without transfer fees.
Yes, they can move freely just like any other EU worker at the end of a contract. That's the first thing. And the nationality clause disappeared. So clubs can now field and select players from across EU countries.
And there was the ARA case. Can this judgment be seen as follow-up to Bosman?
Very much so. Where Bosman concerned a player at the end of his contract, Diarra concerned a player who was actually still under contract with his football club. And so the court took it one step further. It had to assess the transfer rules established by FIFA for players who were still under contract. And in such a scenario where there is no agreement from the former club, a player can be refused a license to play. Not only that, the clubs that would be interested in hiring that player's services, they are actually liable to sanctions. And so the court assessed that system and considered it to be too restrictive as to the free movement of players. So what the court in essence did was to strengthen the position, the legal position of professional football players.
You mentioned several times FIFA. That brings us to the role of football federations. What approach has the court taken towards them?
Well, first of all, the court has repeatedly acknowledged the importance of sport and sport competitions for our societies. That's, by the way, a reflection of what we find in the treaties. Competitions also need rules, obviously, such as rules established by FIFA, by UEFA. But where issues may arise is when these federations act both as regulators and as economic operators. And it's in such a case that the court assesses whether basic EU principles are respected.
That may sound a bit technical. Why should football fans care about these rulings?
Well, first of all, because football is of universal enjoyment. And not only that, it's also a tremendously important economic sector. It's important to stress, I think, there that the court does not want to interfere in the organization of sporting events or sport as such. But what it wants to ensure is that basic EU principles are being respected, such as fairness and non-discrimination on the basis of nationality.
And one final question. Has the court ever ruled on nationality requirements for national football teams?
Well, as a matter of fact, it has. In a rather overlooked paragraph in the Bosman ruling, the court explicitly states that the selection of national teams on the basis of nationality is perfectly lawful under EU law.
So national football teams are safe?
Absolutely.
And disputes about offside decisions?
Well,
disputes?
I would say it's highly unlikely that the court would ever be asked to rule on that.
Thank you, Stefan, for your time and your explanations.
My pleasure.
That was Stefan van der Jocht explaining how the Court of Justice of the EU applies European law to this beautiful game. Enjoy the World Cup and stay with us on Cours des Citoyens for more stories where law meets real life.